Hello. Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'll be talking of a site which is dramatically different to the sites which were presented up until now. But it's also inseparably connected with all those sites that were presented. I'll be talking about Auschwitz, but I'll be talking about Auschwitz not in terms of Auschwitz's history, but in terms of the Auschwitz history after Auschwitz. So in terms of Auschwitz memory formation, in terms of what is Auschwitz today, in terms of what we are doing with Auschwitz, and I'll try to present also what we're supposed to, where we are heading right now with the Auschwitz memory. I will have some suggestions, but I'll be absolutely open into listening into your suggestions later. I'm a little bit torn in this presentation because I'm merging two worlds. One world is the world of academia, the other world is the world of being a guide. And most of the things I do as a guide. So I'm guiding in various Jewish sites in Central Europe, but also in most of the Holocaust sites, including Auschwitz. I'm a little bit torn, but being Central European means having a little bit of schizophrenia in you and dealing with the schizophrenia for your life, and also a lot of cultural patterns to deal with at the same time. Is it working, Brigitte? Okay. There's just one picture I wanted to show you, which obviously I cannot show you. Okay. So talking about Auschwitz in the perspective of after Auschwitz, and talking about Auschwitz as a guide. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emil. That was great. Talking about the historical perspective of Auschwitz and talking about Auschwitz memory formation as a guide, we need to say a few words about what the guides are doing. The guides are processing history. The guides are presenting history. The guides are very often the only people who are actually reading academical papers if they do their job properly. If they access the resources properly, they shall process the academical papers. Actually, they are sometimes a part of other scholars. They are the only people who are reading those things. So they are becoming the only audiences of those papers and those books. The guides are processing and presenting history, which is also focusing about anniversaries. And this year is kind of special. We're meeting here in the 75 years of an anniversary of the Wannsee Conference. We are meeting 74 years after over 200 of Viennese ghetto Jews were deported through forcibly decapitated into Auschwitz. We are meeting in this place already 70 years after the first museums to the German Nazi atrocities or to the Holocaust were established. Yes, 70 years ago there was a decision by the Polish Communist government to establish the two museums. The museum in the former territory of Karl Auschwitz-Birkenau, concentration lager Birkenau in Auschwitz, and the concentration lager Lublin in Majdanek. And this decision is absolutely extraordinary. This decision is taken 2 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. This decision is happening in the time when there's almost no debate in the outside world about the future of those sites. There's a very large debate in Poland in the 40s, which is fascinating. And for the lack of better word, and yes, in the decades after Auschwitz liberation, we're struggling with problems with language for decades. For the lack of better word, and with an idea of protecting the site, we are actually choosing the word museum, because that was the only concept which was providing protection of the site. So the museums were established, and from this point, the entire problem of a museum starts. From this point, the entire problem of presenting the content starts. And later on, the massivity of the visitors, which actually comes almost immediately into the site. It's not a new phenomena. It's not something that started after the Iron Curtain collapsed. It's something that is coming to the site almost immediately. Mostly by the local visitors from the Central Europe or Eastern Bloc. Because we have to remember that the site of Auschwitz is at first becoming an important memorial site, mostly for the Central European community of memory, because they get the access to that and they establish the museum and they control the narrative. So the first narrative of the site is a narrative of a Polish national communist agenda which is realized at this site. And I'm not saying that there's something wrong about it. I'm just giving you an insight into how the facts were on Earth, how the situation was looking like in there. I've made a study of most of the English and American newspapers in the years of, let's say, 1944 and 50s, trying to look for the word Auschwitz. I was asking a question whether the word Auschwitz became a point of memory for Western audiences. It didn't. You'll be surprised to notice that most of the British titles, American titles, are not even covering about the fact of Auschwitz being liberated. There are very small footnotes coming a couple of days later, and I don't want to go into the reasons for that. The reasons are very complicated. The reasons are connected with the geopolitical situation and the Iron Curtain, which is about to divide the continent. But for me, the important factor is Auschwitz as a site, as a term, did not become a place of memory for most of the Western audiences. For the survivors, it was a trauma. For the survivors, it was a trauma hard to release from, hard to narrate, how to talk about, and how to transform into a generational experience. For the second generation of the survivors, it was a very amorphic place, which was actually out of access. You couldn't travel there. This is something that Allah told. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't access that. I know few survivors of Auschwitz which were actually eager enough to show those sites into their children to travel there in the 50s and 60s, and those are really few cases that we know of. So things are not easy because of this Iron Curtain divide. The site is left on the, let's say, Polish Central European side, and that's the community of memory which is organized around it. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, there is the Western Jewish community of memory around the site of Auschwitz. And those two communities of memory are being built in almost complete isolation and separation from each other. On two sides of the Iron Curtain, in absolute isolation from each other, and they are merged in an enormous number of stereotypes of viewing each other, accusing each other. And there are very few platforms of meeting. There are very few platforms of actually seeing a person face to face and processing what happened. This is changing. I'm fast forwarding from a very large topic. This is changing dramatically in the 80s and 90s. So the 80s and 90s is a very intensive time period of conflicts around Auschwitz. We got about 20 years of a perpetual conflict around Auschwitz, which starts in 1983, and pretty much those conflicts are going all the way through into early 2000s. And those are conflicts on various levels. Those are conflicts starting from political and religious levels and going down into very social levels. We could talk for hours about that. For me, there is one added value into all those conflicts. Those conflicts became a platform of meeting. Those conflicts became a platform when, for the first time, the clergy of a Polish Catholic Church is forced to sit at one table with Orthodox Western European rabbis and resolve a conflict. This is actually the first site after the 30s when the representatives of the Polish Catholic Church have to sit at one table with a Jewish organization and resolve a problem, and resolve it constructively. Face each other. And facing each other is a very important factor, particularly when it comes to dealing with trauma. So Auschwitz was on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and Auschwitz was massively visited immediately after liberation. There are certain visits of the Western dignitaries at first before the Iron Curtain. In 1946, Picasso is visiting Auschwitz. We actually have one of his pieces in our collection in the museum. But this is all broken later on by the Iron Curtain. What is the contemporary Auschwitz? Contemporary Auschwitz is torn in a certain dichotomy in between trauma and trivia. And we are traveling on the spectrum when visiting the site, from trauma to trivia. We can say that the spectrum of trauma is very much connected to the prime memory of the site, to the memory of the survivors, to the memory of the second generation, to an incredible level of built expectations about this site, to an incredible level of visually processed images of this site that people come expecting to see. And then they face the site, the contemporary Auschwitz, and in a lot of cases, they are bewildered. They are demanding to be taken into the real Auschwitz site, because the Auschwitz they see doesn't correspond to the Auschwitz they've imagined. And here we are entering into the contemporary world of trivia, of a secondary memory of the site, and of a certain mass tourism construct of this site. So yes, Auschwitz is torn today in between the emotional experience that the visitors are going through, or at least we hope they do go through, and the mass tourist consumption of the site. And talking about the role of mass tourism, last year the site was visited by 2 million visitors. This year probably it will be even more. Where pretty much over the last 15 years, every year there's an additional number of 200,000 of visitors, 200,000 of visitors to a site. When they are coming to visit, they are spending about 3 hours exploring the museum exhibits, because this is the way how the museum is mediating this authentic site into the visitors. And for every visitor, it's critical to remember that he or she is finding hers or himself on the authentic site. And this is something that we are trying to make our guides stress on every possible level. The narrative is less important. The pictures that are shown are less important. The thing that is critically important is the authenticity of the site. We may actually say that on this level of mass tourism consumption and kind of mechanicness of a tourist consumption of the site, Auschwitz is becoming the absolute shrine of the thanatotourism. Unfortunately, there is a distinction like this in the nowadays world of a thanatotourism, of a tourist sites which are connected to the horrendous events in the history of humanity. And people are interested in the sites only for the sake of a horror and trauma that is happening in those places. Talking about networking, there's a network of such places. Unofficial, but there is a network of such places, which is taking us into a completely hard to understand dimension of processing this site. What is very interesting, people are visiting the site and is becoming famous for the numbers of deaths and the massivity of the process, but most of the visitors, in my perspective, are less and less remembering the site as a cemetery. They don't see the cemetery in the site. The function of this slide I'm bringing here is the idea of focusing your attention in the thing which is the least visible in Auschwitz-Birkenau and which is actually the most important in Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's not about the Arbach-Marfai main entrance gate. It's not about the gate of Birkenau. We actually gave away those places into mass tourism already in our contemporary fight over the tourist consumption. But very few visitors are getting into the very back of Birkenau. Very few visitors are getting into the very essence of what is important in Auschwitz. Being at the cemetery, spending a couple of minutes there consciously, and maybe in silence. You don't have to narrate everything, you don't have to talk, because actually through silence you can express much more, particularly at this site there. We are also living in a time when the prime memory of the Holocaust is being transmitted and becoming the secondary memory of the Holocaust. And this is a very dangerous time, because in this transmission moment, we are very prone to all kinds of distortions. Distortions which are not often intended. Distortions which are caused by processing and reprocessing Auschwitz history, by literature, memory, visual arts, politicians, and we can give an ample of examples in which this reprocessing of Auschwitz is going in completely odd ways, and with the good intentions of an author, it's actually becoming at the end the product of Holocaust denial. Distortions which are also unfortunately more and more caused deliberately by using and abusing the site and message of Auschwitz for all kinds of political agendas which are not always legitimate at the site. And we face it more and more often right now. At the same time, we have to remember that Holocaust is one of the most educated events in human history. It's very hard to find another element of human history today which will be more educated than the Holocaust, which is bringing us into another set of problems, the problems of educational fatigue, the problems of using the denial of the Holocaust as a new tool of the Middle East conflict, but also a problem which we will be all facing, the problem of a perpetual, devoid of reflection and over-institutionalized memory. We are sometimes getting too comfortable behind our institutions, which are perpetuating memory, to the level that the people doing them are forgetting about why they are doing it. And I can talk about it, particularly giving you the example of a museum of Auschwitz, which is existing 70 years in that space. So that's a problem. That's a big problem for the future. The problem is, the question is, what are the answers? What are the answers and what is the future? I think I've identified, for the reason of this conference, I've identified I got 3 minutes, I got three major ideas how to get out of this vicious circle of a certain trivialization of the site. How to get out of the vicious circle of mass consumption, how to get out of the vicious circle of joyfulness, selfies, and actually kind of a mass tourism dynamic of behavior, of a group behavior at the site. Because this is something that you observe, even in the groups which are very focused and very serious. There comes a point during the visit when it's going odd ways. And maybe it's natural, maybe we shouldn't fight about it, against it. But what are the possible 3 directions that we shall follow? One of the directions is the direction which we started to enter only about 10 years ago. I mean, we as a kind of global community of people thinking about the Holocaust. And that's a dimension which you are beautifully presenting within the last 1.5 days here, the direction of life. We have to understand Auschwitz as a very static place, as a very static place of death. That's why my presentation is very static, in contrast with your presentations. Your presentations are about life, and they are actually bringing a sense and a meaning into the site called Auschwitz. When I'm talking to Holocaust educators who are always becoming at a certain point very mechanic in their narratives and focused on technological aspects, which is a huge problem, you need to make people aware that Auschwitz is a story about loss of life. And if it's a story about loss of life, you will never understand Auschwitz if you don't understand what was there before Auschwitz. You will never understand Auschwitz if you don't go to Erfurt, if you don't go to Frankfurt, if you don't go to Lublin, if you don't go into all of those communities which existed there, if you don't see a person of bone and flesh who is trapped in the world conflict and takes the best possible decision hoping to save his or her life, and it doesn't work. So actually this narrative of life is critically important. You cannot take a group of 16, 17, 18 years old teenagers into Treblinka without taking them to Warsaw or Białystok. You cannot take them to Bełżec without taking them to Krakow or Lvov. You just cannot do it because you don't know what to show them. You don't know what is lost, and they will not get it. If you focus on the mechanicness of the process, there is another very pervert thought which we have to consider. The nowadays 20, 25 years old man or girl that is being educated into the mechanicness of the process, which the guys are really liking, I have no idea as a teacher where this knowledge will be taken into within the next 5, 10 years. And as a teacher, I'm supposed to be responsible for what I'm teaching. I can have the best of intentions of knowing that I'm generating awareness and consciousness and maybe compassion. But maybe I'm actually instructing somebody. And you have to consider that. If you're a good Holocaust teacher, you have to consider that. Another dimension which we may actually take this heritage into is stop complaining about mass terrorism, but seeing mass terrorism as an opportunity. Seeing mass terrorism of 2 million of visitors at the site coming consciously, or even unconsciously, because a lot of visitors are coming unconsciously to this site, as an educational potential. You get 2 million people visiting the site, and most likely in their lives, this will be the only 3 hours in which they are focusing on the history of World War II and Holocaust. Most likely for most of those people, this will be the only 3 hours of their life. So this is an educational opportunity for the 280 guides in Auschwitz. And we're actually putting very little stress in those presentations on guides themselves, and we should, because the guides are the frontmen. The guides are those who are actually teaching. The guides are those who are actually mediating the research into the audiences. So the guides are critical in the entire consideration of ours. But there is also one more direction which I think we shall go. And it's a direction that we completely obliterated over the last 70 years, and we obliterated it for a reason. After the Holocaust, there comes trauma. I'm very shallowing the concept right now. After the Holocaust, there comes trauma, there comes silence. There comes lack of reflection about the broader concepts of genocide. And I think that we are right now at the stage of transitory from the prime memory into the secondary, transition from the prime memory to the secondary memory, and we have to open up. We have to open up into comparative studies of genocide. We know today how to talk about it. We finally developed this language. Maybe we have to change this language. Maybe this language is not perfect. We are all the time working on this language. We know how to build museums, we know how to build monuments, we know how to teach, we know how to write books. We are completely hopeless in one matter. We are completely hopeless in genocide prevention. Completely hopeless. And that's the last lesson that we have to learn. And I think there's no other place to learn it but in Auschwitz. And going into comparative studies of genocides is critically important, and that's a field of research that we've only entered recently. We've only entered into this field maybe in the last 10, 15 years seriously. Or actually not seriously, in most cases. So that will be another direction of going with the memory of the Holocaust. Is it blasphemous? Is it controversial? It is. Is it legitimate? I think it is, because there's absolutely nothing we can do to help the people who are buried here. There is something we can do. We may remember about them. We may commemorate what happened. We may remember about their lives. But at the same time, we may save the others, and we may prevent other sites like this to be screened into the evening news. So I think that will be the 3 paths out of the trivialization of Auschwitz. To stop complaining about mass terrorism, the comparative studies of genocides, and the life, presenting life before the history takes us into those places. Thank you very much.